So I have just enabled Kerberos authentication on this cluster, and I've added the user A. Moreover, I've designated 10.0.0.199, the host I'm currently logged in as a gateway role. So this host is running Hive Server 2, and it has client configurations defined. I do not have a Kerberos ticket, so if I click KList, I see no credentials are found. Let's talk about how to use Kerberos authentication and some special things to keep an eye out for in order to know that Kerberos authentication is working. With no Kerberos ticket, I expect that I cannot read my home directory or the contents of any directory. And sure enough, I get the privileged access exception. I can also try submitting a job. So this is just the directory where Cloudera's distribution places its jar files. So you'll see Hadoop MapReduce examples.jar in any Hadoop distribution. And I'm going to launch the classic Pi job. Because I don't have a Kerberos ticket, however, I expect this to fail, and sure enough, it does. Specifically, the failure error that I'm seeing is GSS exception, no valid credentials provided. And this happens because this is a Kerberos cluster, so it tries to evaluate the current user. So there's a challenge and response scheme set up in Hadoop between the client and the server. It's a Kerberized cluster, so it asks for the Kerberos ticket, and we don't have one. So let's go ahead and initialize the Kerberos ticket for user A. So now I have a Kerberos ticket, and I can do a hadoop-fs-ls on my user and get the current directories as associated with the permissions of the ticket that I'm logged in as. And I can also launch my Pi job. At this point, I have a job launched correctly and running as the user A. I want to call out one particular log message that we're going to see scrolling up. And these are references to delegation tokens. The way this works is your Kerberos ticket is basically passed through the yarn process, through the MapReduce process, down to the nodes that are actually running the tasks associated. So I've just told my Hadoop cluster to calculate Pi with 10 mappers, and those 10 mappers are going to get scheduled on every node in the cluster. And they need to run with certain authentication now. And that authentication comes from the Kerberos ticket that I just obtained. And that gets passed in the form of a delegation token to every node in the cluster that's running the task. And that task gets launched with the permissions of user A. So that user now needs to be present on that host, even though I never log in as that user to that host. Because the delegation token is present and because the tasks are run as that user, I need that user on that host. And as you can see, the MapReduce job completes successfully. So launching jobs with MapReduce, with Spark, with the HDFS user interface or the HDFS API is very straightforward. You just obtain a Kerberos ticket with KInit. The session is associated with that ticket, and you're allowed to do things. With Hive, it's a little more complicated. First, we no longer want you to run the Hive command line, so don't do that. You instead want to use Beeline, which is a client, Hive-specific client that uses JDBC to connect to Hive Server 2. So there's a Hive Server 2 process running on this host. It's installed, it's run by default on Cloudera Manager. When you run the Hive command line, the Hive client will just launch a MapReduce job right against the cluster. With Beeline, it gives you a point to control access to Hive, to control access to the metastore, to provide row-level access, and to provide an additional layer of authentication. Instead of launching Hive, we're going to launch Beeline, and I know that I'm running a Hive Server 2. I need to have a Kerberos ticket associated with my session, so I already have that Kerberos ticket here. If I don't, the next connect string that I'm going to run will fail. Also, I need to have a specific argument on my JDBC connect string when I'm connecting to a Kerberized cluster. I'm just going to type this out first, and then I will explain it. And I know I'm running Hive Server 2 here on this host. So far, this is very straightforward. It's a standard JDBC URL. It says, make a connection to Hive Server 2 running on this host. Let's try it, see what happens. And it says, cannot open without the port. Add the port. Hive Server 2 listens on port 10,000 by default. So it says unsupported mechanism type plain. What does that mean? It means we're trying to authenticate with just plain authentication the username and the password with plain text, and it's failing because this is a Kerberized cluster. So as you can see, the error messages are not always very friendly. So this is not saying you're trying to connect to a Kerberized cluster with no reference to a Kerberos ticket, but that's what this error message means. So in order to do that, I need to refer to a Kerberos ticket. And specifically, I need to refer to the Kerberos ticket of the Hive Server 2 process. And I can get that from the Cloudera documentation or from Cloudera Manager. I have Cloudera Manager set up in another window. I'm going to pop this over real quick, and I'm going to go over to the Kerberos Credentials tab. And you can see all of these credentials here. What I want is the Hive Server 2 that's associated with the host that I'm connected to. I believe it's this one. It is. So I want to refer to the same principal that Hive Server 2 is running with in order to make this work. It's going to prompt for a username and password. You can put in anything here. In fact, this is going to be discarded because it's authenticating using Kerberos. So it's authenticating using the Kerberos ticket that I'm already logged in as. If you get to a point where you have the transaction isolation prompt here, you're successfully connected to Hive, and you can do things like create tables and describe tables. If you've gotten this far, congratulations, you've successfully connected to Hive on a Kerberized cluster. There are ways to make that connection string easier. Specifically, you can make Hive Server and Impala authenticate against Active Directory using a username and password instead of Kerberos. That saves the client from having to understand this Kerberos stuff. We'll talk about that in another video. The connection to Impala is pretty much exactly the same. The port number is 25,000 instead of 10,000. But other than that, it's the same. And that wraps it up.